Sometimes the answer is no. If you've done this task analysis well enough, you have the level of granularity necessary to create the test blueprint that you're going to want to write. Sometimes you need to get a little more granular, and that's a discussion you have about the objectives of the test and what it's intended to achieve. But the behavior elements there, the job elements, is something that is sometimes done, sometimes not. Again, it depends on the nature of the job. If I'm developing a test to ensure safety around a piece of machinery, as I was describing before, we might go down to the behavior element level. But that's a judgment that the professional has to make. So these are just some words that go along with what I just described to you in the pictures. What a work process is. It's a collection of work functions. Well, what's a work function? It's a collection of tasks. Well, what's a task? And I'll show you a little bit more what a task is in a moment. And behavioral elements, as you might imagine, make up tasks. So here's a diagram of what I was just saying, is that, and this process I'm describing to you, I call a work standards model. I don't call it a competency model. I don't usually use the word job analysis with clients I'm working with, but we're coming up with a work standards model, because these are the standards for work. You need to do these tasks competently. You need to have this knowledge to do that task. So they're work standards. And on the left is what we just talked about. And as I said, multiple choice test questions and other test types, situational judgment tests, they are usually well served if you've done a good job at the tasks and work functions. So getting good task and work function information is usually the end of the road in doing the job analysis. Now you're ready to start developing the test blueprint. So that's work on the left. On the right is people. So if a person can do a task, they have that skill. So when someone says to me, well, did you get the skill information? Some people do job analysis and they do task analysis, and separately they do skill analysis. And skill analysis is a mix of behavior, it's a mix of knowledge. Sometimes they rewrite the tasks. The clarity about definitions is lost sometimes. And I'd like to think that a simpler approach is better. But this is people on the right, where they have domain knowledge and they have the competency to do a task. So that's how then you have the information to form the basis of developing your test. And this becomes critical information for establishing content validity. Content validity is an important aspect of a test. So what I'm going to talk about is how to write a good task statement. And so here are some steps. I'm going to get now into the nitty-gritty. How do you recognize a good task statement when you see one? And a lot of people have given a lot of thought to this subject. I taught job analysis at the university for 3 or 4 years and had read a lot of literature and books on this subject. And there's a lot of good thinking in this area. So let me share some of it with you. So you need to pick a skill you're going to measure. And for our purposes, since you've done all this good work on employability skills, you probably want to start with, well, what are one of those employability skills on that list that is kind of my target? So say it's something in the IT arena, problem solving in the IT arena. So you want to pick a job family. Are we in accounting? Are we in IT? Are we in sales? So you want to know, I want to measure these skills in this job family, because you need to get real granular about this so that you write good questions. And then you need to look at your job analysis and say, okay, how does this skill map to the job analysis results I have? So you have a target, and you have a target job, you have target skill, you have target tasks. Now you're in a position, you have enough job context where you can write good job-related items. I'll give you an example. So if you were picking from a list of occupations, you might pick a occupation here from this list. Now, here's a form. Again, this is available to you. This is one of the forms that are available online. And this is so a good task statement. So here's the definition of a good task statement. A good task statement has the following elements in it. When I read task statements, look at the top column there. It says, performs what action? So a good task statement starts with a verb. To whom or what? They take some action. What do they do it on? So there's an action verb, and there's an object of that action verb, like testing electrical circuits. Testing is what you do. What gets tested? Electrical circuits. Now, there's some standard or some procedure or some process upon instructions or what source of information. So you might do that testing of the circuits following some well-known procedure, using some particular devices. By the way, this is a good source of knowledge information, this particular part of a task statement when you're deriving the knowledge information from the tasks. Using what employability skill, what kinds of employability skill is used to do this particular problem, and what's the goal? Sometimes the goal is self-evident. If you're in sales, the goal is to sell. So I don't always write out that because it's inherent in the statement itself, but not always. So the last part of a task statement. So this you might thinking, wow, this is really a very granular level of attention to writing a task statement. Does it really have to be this detailed? And I'll tell you from experience, it works. I get better task statements when people follow a rule, and I give them a rule. Here's a rule to write task statements. Start with a verb. What is it you're doing? What is the object of that action? How is it done? With what kinds of procedures and methods and such? And so if they follow the procedure, and now you write a set of task statements that serve you well for your content validity evidence and serve you well when you write items. So imagine if you had a collection of these. Imagine if you had 30, 40, 50 of these, and you had to write a test. You could use this information to write your questions. And that's the goal. That's the whole idea of the job analysis. Because in an educational setting, you have a curriculum to go to. We don't necessarily have that in a work setting. In an educational setting, you go to the curriculum and say, well, what are the domains of knowledge being measured? How much time is spent on each domain? What are the more important topics? Now, you know that as a subject matter expert. There are people who have written about what the domains are. That's usually more knowable. But in employment settings, you don't have that. You have to create that information, and this is the process that we've been describing here that creates that process. So when you get this information, you now have the right stuff for each work function, because you want to do these for a set of work functions. For each set of work functions, you do a set of these, and now you're in a position to start thinking about the test blueprint and your test content. Here's another example. Financial analyst, one of the things they do is interpret and communicate information. The action is they draw charts and graphs using computers and spreadsheets, interpreting information for technical reports. So that's what they do. Now, is there a lot of knowledge required for that? That comes next. But once you get the task statements down, now you can go in a second round of interviews with subject matter experts and give them the task statements and say, well, here we know these are critical task statements. Tell us what they need to know to do this. Give me the knowledge component of the job associated with these tasks. So now you have yet more information to write test questions from. In a large scale test validation process, it's not unusual to take all these task statements, to put them in a survey, and to send the survey out to hundreds or thousands of workers who do the job. On one occasion, I sent the job analysis tasks, several hundred tasks, to 17,000 telecommunications technicians so that we could determine what telecommunications technicians do. And don't be surprised if they do different things in different places. The master set of tasks we had in New York City, some of those tasks were more important than they were in some more remote area where the telecommunication equipment had to deal with rough terrain, mountains and rivers and lakes that are less an issue in New York City. It's more about the interference with the buildings. So the task analysis is important because you'll find that for different subgroups of your target population, they may have different importance. The tasks may be of different importance. So one group of tasks may be very important for one group of technicians and less important for another, by nature of where they work or the department they're in. So the job analysis on these really big high-stakes jobs, we had 50,000 technicians when I did this work, and so it was very important that we did a very thorough job analysis and documented things carefully. So just to give you a perspective, this is not 3 or 4 people sitting around the table for a few hours making these decisions. It can be done in a very formal way. And again, the professional guidelines talk to this. So the Department of Labor that I referred to before, they have a taxonomy of jobs, the standard occupational codes. And there's a website that has lots of information about those jobs. So they were developed this website, and it's anybody, you could log on to it right now if you cared to do so. ONET is the website where the U.S. government, for jobs that are common globally, but they're primarily U.S. jobs, have a lot of detailed information about those jobs. So oftentimes where I start my job analysis is I go to ONET, I put in information about the job that I'm looking for, and it provides me with a lot of basic information about jobs. So if you're in a position where you want to understand the job better, I encourage you to use ONET. It has a lot of information. They have about 900 job titles in ONET and almost 20,000 task statements. Now that may sound like a lot, and it is in fact one of the most comprehensive systems that exist. Yes?
Yes, thank you so much for this workshop. My name is Tahira Hoke. I'm from Prince Sultan University, and I would like to know, how do educators use the information from this website, as well as what you've been discussing this morning? Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question. Good question. So the job analysis part relates to education when you're developing skill tests that will certify employment skills. The item writing part applies to education and work settings equally. The way you might use ONET is, nobody knows all jobs. I've seen a lot of jobs, and I haven't seen them all yet. I haven't seen all 900 yet. But if you want to get some early education about a job, this is where you go. Because they will have a lot of detailed information about each of these 900 job titles. And they have secondary teachers, university professors, and they have all that kind of information in there too. So if you're looking for education jobs, they're in there. Now, not all of them. I mean, an economy has more than 900 jobs, right? But it's one of the most extensive systems that exist. That's a discussion for another day. But anyway, so I wanted you to know about ONET. It's free. It's available to everybody. It has tons of information. It has information about salaries in the U.S. labor market. So if you're interested in working at a university in the United States, you can see what they're paid in the region you're thinking of going to. So that's the link to ONET, and because of the technical difficulties, we can't click on the link and send you there. I was hoping to be able to click on the link and just show you how to navigate through it. But it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy to get through the ONET system. It has task information. The KSAO is an acronym that we industrial psychologists invented, and it stands for knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. It gets back to my Tower of Babel problem. What does that mean? Other characteristics. That means everything else on that list. So, lots of information there. So one other source I'd recommend are these boards that have jobs. So what do they put? If they put job ads there. What's in a job ad? Job duties. What's the job duty? It's another word for a task. They put knowledge requirements. They put education and other things there too, but I've often used the monster.com or other job websites and just grab information about my target job to get information to start the job analysis. Because I don't usually go to the client with a blank sheet of paper and say, tell me what all your tasks are. ONET, job boards are very helpful in this regard. One last resource that I haven't listed here is when the job that I'm studying has a distinct domain of knowledge, I have found it useful to go to universities and look at the curriculum descriptions and the course descriptions. So in doing some chemical engineering jobs not too long ago, I went to several universities, courses on chemical engineering to get information about knowledge domains, knowledge topics, so that I could start to build a list of that information that when it came time to say, is this knowledge required for this task, I could have a list of knowledge information. So the internet is just replete with information that can help in understanding the world of work. It takes a little work, but it's necessary to understand what are the requirements for jobs and how can I organize that information so that now I have a basis to write my test questions. It may sound like a lot of work, and it can be. You have to judge how important the test system you're going to put in place. When I was working with the technicians, we had 17,000 technicians and probably 35,000 job applicants every year. So it was pretty darn important we got that right. So I'm describing a more extensive process when I give you the example of the communication technicians. So I think that's our topic with regard to job context. So when the group got much larger, it became not so feasible for you to actually write a task statement, but that was the point of this slide. At an earlier point, we thought the group might be a little smaller, and I was going to do a group activity where everybody writes a task statement, and using the form, but you don't have the form, so we're not going to do this. But it's good just to practice writing them using that form. Get the form. You're happy to have you use it as often as you want, but it was intended to help, and it takes some practice. So that you know what work at a fairly granular level is being done in those organizations. So employers will cooperate with you because if they know you're going to create people that they can hire, and if they know the criteria that you're using to test and train people to, they'll be very happy. I've done this with a number of educational institutions in the United States where they said, this part of our university focuses on these jobs. And I help them with a job analysis so their curriculum and their assessment could be very closely aligned with what industry needs. Does that answer your question? Thank you for your question.
You have mentioned a lot of knowledge in your presentation now. So how can we transfer that tacit knowledge to be in paper or like explicit knowledge? You are talking about personal knowledge, right?
Personal knowledge.
Yeah. How can we transfer it to be in paper?
So is your question about, I'm going to talk about next about how to write test questions. So is that what you're asking, or are you asking how do I take the dialogue I have with subject matter expert and get it on paper.
No, I'm talking about knowledge management.
Okay.
So we have two types of knowledge, right? Yeah. Tacit knowledge and explicit knowledge, right?
Okay.
So you are talking about personal knowledge. How can we like transfer it to be like in paper?
Yeah. Great question. So knowledge can be very complicated. We can talk a long time about what is knowledge. There's explicit knowledge, there's tacit knowledge, there's metacognition. It can get, and I'm going to speak a little bit to it in a moment. But you can interview subject matter experts who are experts and talk to them about how they think through a process and what knowledge, there's like factual information they have, but they also have a lot of heuristics, like rules, mental rules, and all of that is great stuff. And there is a thing called cognitive task analysis. And there's some interesting literature on cognitive task analysis, and if I understand your question, it's in part asking how do you get at the deeper kind of knowledge that experts have. And I would say the short answer is cognitive task analysis. And if you've ever built an expert system, you may have engaged in the kind of interviewing with experts that is called cognitive task analysis. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to the bottom about item writing. So imagine that we've done a great job analysis. We have all our task information. We know what knowledges go with which tasks. We've used all that to create a wonderful blueprint. We know what topics we want to measure now. We want to know how many items, we know how many items for each topic. And we know what are the more important topics. And this is the same place you typically start out in education after you've looked at a curriculum. So your curriculum analysis is something you're probably more familiar with. In industry, it's job analysis that gets you the blueprint. So now we have a blueprint and we can move on to start writing items. So the process of developing a test is what I've listed here. So you have your blueprint. There's types of items, so you have to decide what types of items, and I'll talk about that briefly, and how to classify them. For knowledge areas, I'm a big fan of multiple choice questions, and I'll tell you why shortly. You're going to take your tasks, as I've said, and turn them into test questions, the STEMs, and you may choose a test type called situational judgment items, and I'll describe briefly what that is too. So you probably all know what a blueprint is, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. As I've described, it's how many questions you write for what topics. So when you write items, you want them to be at different levels of difficulty. So as a writer, as an item writer, you don't want to make them all hard, and you don't want to make them all easy. You want a spread. So when I'm looking at items, and we get data about the items, I want to see that we have a spread of difficulty. Now, this is a very simplistic looking arrangement. It can get a little more involved than this, but for each topic, when I do a blueprint, I add this other information to make sure that my item writers are writing items of different levels of difficulty, because the test is a better test when it has different levels of difficulty. I found that item writers can relate to this way to think about difficulty. So you'll see an item writing form, which also is online. I've made this, you'll see in a moment, an item writing form. But it has this scheme here, this layout of, is this an item that a novice could do? It's something that doesn't take a lot of training. You expect when someone's right on the job, this will be something they can already do or can do quickly. So that's the novice level. Minimally competent means if you're minimally competent on the job, this is the stuff you can do and you can know. So you want some items that are like, it's kind of where the passing score is. It's at the threshold. If you're below this, you're probably not going to be able to do the job. If you're above this, you're at least minimally competent to be successful in the job. So having the item writers write items targeted to that is helpful. Then the next level is they're competent. They don't need a lot of supervision. They can do a lot parts of the job without being reviewed. They're competent. They've got a number of years' experience. And of course, then we have our masters. So as a way to help item writers arrange the items on a scale that covers a lower end of competence to a higher end of competence, this has been helpful. And I asked the writers, think about a person you know who's new on the job. That's that minimally competent novice person. What can that person do? What does that person know? So write items that fit that person versus the people who've been on the job and they teach other people. They're masters. They teach other people how to do the job. So write some items for that person too, because we want to know if somebody's that good. If they can pass those items, then our test is measuring at that high end, and we can identify people at the high end. If you don't write more difficult items, you never know when someone's far up on the scale. You only measure the bottom part of the scale. So this is a way to ensure item writers do that. So I like this metaphor of a ruler. So we're trying to write items that are spread out across that ruler. If you write items only at the lower end of the ruler, you're only measuring people down there. You don't know if someone's higher up on the ruler. Or if you write them just that are very difficult, then you can't measure if someone is a novice or minimally competent. So you need to spread them out across the ruler. And there are statistical methods, actually, to array your items after you get them, to array the items on this ruler. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom was an educational psychologist many, many years ago. His scheme is still used by many. I see many educators using Bloom's taxonomy. And it's a pretty good way to think about what are the different kind of mental processes that are engaged when someone's completing a test and answering questions. What I find, though, is that the definitions of these different levels of cognitive complexity, the definitions aren't distinct enough. And so people have some difficulty making an item that's a synthesis item versus an evaluation item. And so what I've done is I've simplified it. So based on some good work in cognitive psychology, we know that a learning process starts at declarative knowledge. You have to know the facts. So that's kind of part of Bloom's taxonomy. That's the bottom of it. So I like that. So we want to write some items that are kind of fact items that everybody needs to know as a basis of performance. And then we want to know things that are a little more involved than just knowledge. You know, how do I do certain procedures, procedural knowledge, and then the higher level, consistent with Bloom's taxonomy, is this problem solving. So what I usually use with item writers is I say, write items of these three types. They understand Bloom's taxonomy. You want to write some items that are procedural. How do you solve this part of the problem, not the whole thing? And then you want the more challenging questions, the problem-solving questions. So that's a very explicit part of the item writing form, that they on purpose write each of these types of items in a set of each. So there's some definitions of declarative knowledge. Procedural knowledge. Here's an example of an item that this is a part of doing some evaluation. So it's a procedure in a larger procedure an accountant might go through in terms of profitability analysis. So if it was a bigger problem that involved more problem solving, it wouldn't be a procedural item. Now, admittedly, there's a little judgment in some of this, but I find this scheme works pretty well with declarative knowledge, procedure, and then problem solving. Here's a problem-solving analysis item where the item is written poorly because the question actually gives away the answer. The only answer here that has two things in it is the first one, and the question part is a plural. What are? So it's not a particularly good item, even as a problem-solving item, because if you say, well, what are common tools? There's only one choice that has tools. It's A. we'll get into some item writing rules later. So when I talked about item classification, referring to these three aspects we just talked about. So we have our topics, and for every topic, we have a set of items that we want to have different cognitive types, declarative, procedural, and problem solving, and different difficulty levels: novice, minimally competent, competent, and master. So this is the cube here that you want to fill up. That for every topic, you want different cognitive complexity and different difficulty levels. And so when I'm working with item writers, I give them this list. I said, here's how you want to be writing your items. You want to write items for each of these boxes. So that there are 12 boxes there. So there's all the combinations of novice. There's novice knowledge, and then there's master knowledge. There's things that masters know. And maybe this addresses your question from before a little bit. Sure. I find that, and maybe you're sitting there thinking, I don't like multiple choice items because they don't measure very well. I find with working with item writers, they're good at writing declarative knowledge. They're pretty good at writing procedural knowledge, but it's hard to write problem-solving questions, especially as we get to more competent and master. And it's the inability or the difficulty of writing those items that is criticized as a weakness in the format of multiple choice question. But when you write good items of that sort, multiple choice questions work quite well. And so I know they come under a lot of criticism as not measuring complex thinking. Well, if you don't write an item that is a complex problem-solving sort of question, of course it's not going to measure that kind of complex thinking. But you need to set out to write it in that way. And they can. It just takes more work. It's hard. So this is also online. This is the item writing form I was referring to before. And some clients have taken this and put it online, so they capture this in a form, a Google form, and that's how they capture their items. This is just a paper form I hand out as well, and this is capturing the information about, you can see at the bottom there, for every item, they have to check off which one of these is it. Is it a novice, minimally competent, competent, master, and what kind of cognitive complexity is it? So in this way, the item writers, and we can count and keep track of the fact that they're doing a proper, comprehensive item writing process. And this is true whether you're in education or in industry. These principles hold in both settings. So please make use of it as much as you like. So we've talked about multiple choice items. Let me talk about other types of items that one could use if one chose to do so, and some trade-offs for the different types of items. So there are more objective item types, like multiple choice and situational judgment tests, and there are more subjective sorts of assessments. So essays, role plays, work samples, they're obviously involve more judgment and they're more subjective in nature versus the multiple choice, fill in the blank, true, false at the top. So that's one judgment you need to make. And another one is, do I want to use images? Do I want to use audio or video in my questions? That is becoming more and more feasible because the technology is getting better and better to make the items more complex. So in problem solving, it's nice that we can have some audio or video or images that we can present the test taker to get at those problem solving for master kinds of problems. So these are some judgments you have to make. What I'm going to talk about is the objective test formats in a moment. I'm going to talk about those types in a little more detail next. But here's an example. It's nice that there's software that allows you to have an image and either a hotspot or, in this case, there's a letter there that you click on it here's an image, there's a question about declarative knowledge for Excel. What does A do? And that's your test question. Saves a file, deletes the file, and so on. It's nice that you can have the image there and in a hotspot. So here are a list of common objective item types that I'm going to talk about, and their strengths and weaknesses of each. Not all of them work equally well. So true-false items, I would never encourage you to do that. The reason is that a person can guess the right answer 50% of the time. So if you have a whole bunch of multiple choice items, guess what's the lowest score on average that's possible? It's 50%. So you're already halfway up the ruler. One of the goals of good item writing is to minimize the influence of guessing in writing the items. So as an item writer, you want to use a strategy and an approach that minimizes the influence of guessing. And by their nature, true-false is half of it's guessing. Now, some people will get less than 50% because they're just bad guessers. But on average, it's low score people will get higher scores than they should because of guessing. And that undermines the validity and the quality of the test. Matching columns. So matching columns are I don't encourage those either. They're a bit of a clerical process for the test taker. I mean, if they're really short, why didn't you just write some knowledge items or some multiple choice items from that? If they're longer, it becomes a little complicated to keep track of what goes where. And the questions are dependent on each other. Let me show you an example. So in this example here, William Faulkner wrote Sound and Fury. So I have 4 in column A and 4 in column B. Once I get one of those wrong, I have to get another one wrong. And that's not a good characteristic of an item. So multiple choice, if you make the list longer and the list's uneven, now it becomes a clerical activity for the person to keep track of it. And second principle of writing good items is make it simple. And I have my 40 rules of item writing. That's one of them. Keep it simple. So this process often doesn't measure well, and if you make it longer and bigger, it becomes too complicated for the testing time, especially if there's a relatively limited testing time. So I always discourage multiple choice, matching items. So forced choice is a method that's increased in popularity lately. And if you've ever taken a personality test or a vocational interest test, you probably took a forced choice item. There are different ways to do this, but they don't measure knowledge as much as they measure judgment and some of those employability skills about sociability, maybe emotional awareness. What they do is they give you a pair of statements that are kind of equally attractive. Like, I like to spend time with my friends. I like to read interesting books. So spending time with my friends is kind of a sociability thing. Reading books is kind of a more academic interest in life. So if I'm trying to see which of these characterizes you, I put those two equally attractive choices together, and you can only choose one. It works pretty well. So forced choice items are not a bad choice when you're looking to measure things that aren't knowledge. They're more judgment. I could put two judgment statements where I had a student who failed a test and came up to me with this particular kind of excuse. What would I do? And there are two equally reasonable things to do. One's a better choice than the other. You have to choose one. So one of the problems is that they tend to correlate with general intelligence. So the research on forced choice items is that they can work well, especially to avoid people who are kind of gaming the test. If I'm in an employment setting, I'm going to try to tell you not what I would do, but what I think is the right answer so I get the job. So these forced choice item types are good in those situations because it's hard to game it. So here's an example of a forced choice item for leadership. And these are some leadership skills on the right. And sometimes you can put not 2 things together, but like 4 things together and say what's most like you and what's least like you. And the thing most like you gets 2 points. The thing least like you gets 0 points. And the things you didn't pick each get 1 point. So these are interesting item formats that are increasing in popularity that can serve some purposes. And you can go through a lot of items quickly this way. Notice, by the way, the average rating on these items, we had data on these items, and it's pretty equal. All of these are equally attractive. You don't want to put something that's very attractive and very unattractive in the same set. So there could be a set of pretty unattractive things that were all rated 2, but don't put things rated 2 with things rated 4. Fill in the blank are reasonable item types, especially if you have software that can have some rules in it that can accept a variety of types of responses. So they're short answer, and if you have good scoring criteria, these can work reasonably well, and the software is getting better and better at reading text and and being able to interpret it correctly for scoring purposes. You all probably have had experiences with essays in your life where you thought you wrote a particularly good essay and your teacher didn't. Essays are very subjective. It's challenging unless you work really hard on the scoring criteria. It's challenging to write essays well and to score them consistently and reliably well. So and it's time consuming. So as a result, if you're measuring knowledge, the probably best choice, what I always recommend, is multiple choice items. Despite the fact that, as I said before, some people find that they don't believe they measure problem solving. So I want to talk a little bit more about the item writing. So there are a set of rules I think I have coming up next. No, I have a couple of things about multiple choice items. They're recommended because statistically, if you do research on them, they work well. I mean, we have a lot of statistical methods that fit multiple choice items. And those statistical methods identify the fact that they work better than most item types. So you're more likely to get a valid test with good reliability, indexes for them, and just history shows that's true. They have a lot of advantages, software of many varieties, score them. I think I just said all these things. Normally you're going to want to write a multiple choice with 1 correct answer and 3 or 4 wrong answers. And if you've done this sort of work, you realize how hard it is to write good wrong answers. It's just, so that's why it's usually 4 and not 5. But if you could do 5, that would make the guessing rate, because guessing's at play here, right? If I have 4 choices, my guess rate is 25%. If I have five options, guessing rate now goes down to 20%, which is a whole lot better than 50% for multiple choice, for true and false. But the challenge is writing good wrong answers. That's one of the challenges. So here are my item writing rules. So how are we doing with time here? Just doing a time check. What time is it? You want a 30-minute break? What time is it? 10:30. Okay. You want to have a 10-minute break? Suggestion it might be a good time for a 10-minute break. You want to do that? Okay. Why don't you do that? We'll be back. We'll do the item writing rules. Thank you. Thank you.
3 items, 3 choices.
Well, then the guess rate's 33%.
So it's better.
Well, no, it's worse because it's higher. Right? You want the guess rate to be as low as possible. So, 20 minutes? 20 minutes? Would you please join us again in 20 minutes? 20-minute break? 20 minutes? Please.
A friend of mine has a course called Lazim So how can we like make a good exam, a fair exam? Like
Yeah,
this?
jeez. I'm wondering how.
Please clear.
Normally what they do is give them more time to the test. And sometimes they'll give the instructions verbally so that there's the attention, because the reading is easier to instruct. New York City. New York City.
New York?
New York
USA.
University.
It's not nice to meet you.
My pleasure.
Welcome.
Thank you. you mind asking a question? No. Everybody should know I think about that. I like the question. No, the question that asked you. Oh, okay. About course last. Yes. Okay. This will do it. Yeah. That's fine. You want to get the presentation? So send me an email, and I'll send you a presentation.
This presentation,
Is it online?
what I think موجود على التطبيق.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
My
Can I
pleasure.
take a picture?
Sure.
تبين أعاونك بالصورة بعد؟ إيه.
if it's going well. It could be well. About what this? Yes. The organizer, I see, they know, they told me. You can, let me see. I can send them to you. Let me see if I can find my card. If you can't find them online, send me an email and I'll send it to you. Sure. Oh, good. Actually, that's interesting because that's where I was at our age. I started in pattern psychology and moved over to mission. You probably will have more options in terms of kinds of jobs in terms of the measurements. It's quantitative. Machine learning, machine learning, natural language processing. To me, there's a whole new ways to natural language processing. Testing. So I'll wait 5 minutes. I can start?
Before you get too far away from the essay writing, I just want you to know, especially with educators, and they tend to.
So we'll get started here. You want me to stay? Okay. Well, this part is easier. No. You want- I can stand here? Or you want me to use this? I can use this. So I hope you enjoyed your break. There's one portion left that I'd like to cover here in the time that remains. What I've done is accumulated a set of rules on writing multiple choice test questions that are, some comes out of literature, academic work, some comes from reading persons who write test questions a lot, and some comes from my own experience and that of my colleagues. So I want to share these rules for you, which are also available in a handout, and just give you an idea of some, I'd like to think, practical wisdom on writing test questions. So that's what I plan to do, is the remaining part of this presentation, and then we can have some little time for questions. So if you haven't written items before, the language for them are, the question part is the stem. We have some number of alternatives or distractors or wrong answers. And so when you're reading about these things, they're items, they're stems, there's distractors, and they're alternatives. That's the language we use. So the question part is the stem, and the alternatives are the choices that you write. The incorrect answers are called distractors, and the task statements that I talk so much are really good for writing the stems. They can help with the alternatives as well, but they're certainly helpful to write the stems. Sometimes you'll see people writing items and they take them right out of the book or right out of a website or right out of some training. With these days, with the amount of access to the internet and information, people have been exposed to them and they'll see the items. So just don't copy things that are too close to what's already been in a book or the examples you used previously. It's difficult to do good item writing. For those of you who've done it, you know that it takes practice. The idea of the item writing form and these rules is to help people do that better. And I've trained a lot of item writers over time, and they can get better by following the rules. And my point number 5 here, as I made earlier, that multiple choice items written properly can really cover a wide range of complexity. Anything that influences, rule number 6, anything, and you want to think about anything that influences the ability to guess the item correctly weakens the items. And when you have weak items, when you do the math on the validity and reliability of the test, it lowers the validity and reliability of the test if people can guess. Now, that's one reason you don't want true-false items. It's harder to get reliable tests with a lot of true-false items. But there are other reasons why people can guess questions correctly as well, and I'll have some examples here in my rules shortly. But, and as you write the questions, you want to sit as an item taker, as a test taker, say, could I guess this answer correctly based on the way this was written? And there are times when it's true, and I'll give you some examples soon. So the persons who have low skills, of course, they're going to use guessing more often. There are a lot of questions they don't know. The strategy they use most in test taking is guessing. So if your items are weak because they're not 4 alternatives, or they're not written well so that guessing plays a bigger role, then those low-skilled test takers may have a better chance. So I always look at the reading difficulty level of the test questions and try to make it as low as possible unless you're testing reading difficulty. But if you're not testing reading difficulty, why make that a component of the item? When you see a test question that's very long or trying to use more complex sentence structures or language, you now introduce a new thing that you're measuring, ability to interpret the meaning of the question. And that's often not what you're trying to test. You want to see if they have a certain procedural knowledge or they can do problem solving, not do reading comprehension. So depending on the audience, you would like to keep the reading level as low as you can. And most software will give you a measure of the reading difficulty of your test. Just a rule of thumb, shorter stems have lower reading difficulty. Simple choice of simple words. In English, I often find people utilize the word utilize instead of use the word use. So that's an example. Pick use, not utilize. And I find myself editing questions a great deal for that reason. So keep the reading difficulty simple and appropriate for the test. Don't make it something that's being measured. So here's anything. This speaks to the layout of the test questions. Anything that, if it's hard to understand the instructions, or if it's hard to understand the format, or if it's not prepared clearly for the test taker, anything that distracts them can result in them getting the item wrong inappropriately. While we're on the subject of instructions, as you know, people tend not to read instructions, or if they read them, they don't read them very carefully. So it becomes necessary for the person developing the test to think about how to write the testing instructions. You don't want to write a paragraph. People don't read paragraphs. If you can have 2 or 3 bulleted statements that guide the test taker as to what to look at in the questions, there may be a set of questions that have a certain set of rules that go with them. You need to spend time on thinking about the instructions and making them as simple and short as possible, because otherwise people will not read them too quickly, they're distracted or they're nervous, and then they're getting questions wrong, not because they don't know it and they're not skilled, it's because the instructions trip them up. And there's an example here. So how many times have you spoken to an item writer and they like the item they wrote because it's tricky, and they want to see if they can be more clever and outwit the test taker, and they think someone is of good ability if they can find the trick or the ambiguity in a question. They make for bad items. Trying to outwit the test taker is not a goal of an item writer. So I encourage item writers all the time to be as obvious as possible about what you're trying to measure. Don't try to be clever or ambiguous or think that this is a trick question, so that's a good thing. Generally, it's a bad thing. And we find these things when we do an item analysis. An item analysis is a quantitative analysis based on data, and you can look at all the questions and look at each of the alternatives and do statistical analysis of them, and you find bad items that way. And trick items commonly end up being bad items. The problem with this item here is that the reader might think that what you're after is Oracle software and not just software licenses in general. So this is a maybe subtle thing, but if I'm a test taker and you're after software licenses generally, and you wrote Oracle, I might know something that's unique about the Oracle license and choose that. So you really have to think hard about other test takers and how they would process the information that you've been giving them in the item stem. This is kind of a self-evident one. Easy items to write are items that are clearly, the right answers are clearly right or wrong, very common knowledge. These are items that are even below a novice level. So you want to, or way over a master's level. You want to get items that, again, fit those ability levels I was describing to you early: novice, competent, minimally competent, and master. This is available to you, this list of rules, by the way, and I'm not going to go through all the examples, but the examples are there to help you understand what was meant by the rule. Something like this is overly specific. I know it's a declarative knowledge, so unless there's some special aspect of history at a particular time, generally a very specific item like this is not a helpful item to write. It's too specific. You know, some of you may know that if you are writing a test for math, it actually also correlates with anxiety. So here you think you're writing a math test and you're measuring math pure and simple, but actually you're also measuring something else, anxiety. It's difficult to measure things purely. It's just a psychometrician's challenge. How do I write items that measure one thing and only that one thing? Before I mentioned with reading difficulty, this is the same reason we don't want to have the question statements complicated, because if you're trying to measure math, you're also measuring reading difficulty at the same time. And now you've confounded what you're trying to measure. So the lower score might be because of reading skills and not because of math skills. So similarly, in other settings, try to measure one construct at a time for each item, which is related to this subject here of sometimes you'll see items where there are two topics intentionally included in the item. That's two items. If someone gets this wrong, you don't know if they got it wrong because of they didn't know what bus size was or they didn't know what clock speed was. So when you see two concepts in a single item, take it apart, make two items, and then move on. So it's important to be able to distinguish these aspects of knowledge. And so here's a better way to do that. Make the two items, and now you've got more items in your item pool that are cleaner measures. So this was the whole point earlier this morning about the reason for a job analysis is because you want to write your items for the parts of the blueprint that are most important. So if it's in education and you have a curriculum, some parts of the curriculum are more important than others. If you've done a job analysis, you know that some parts of the job are more important than others. So you want to be sure that you're writing items that align with what has been evaluated to be the most important parts of the job. This is a subtle aspect of writing a bank of items. It can occur when you're writing a lot of items that the stem in one question gives away the answer to another question. In this situation here, the word charlatan is in the stem and you're looking for the meaning of it. But the stem of another item, and it may be many pages further away in the assessment, but it may turn out that the stem in another item gives the definition for charlatan. So if I do the first item first and I don't know what charlatan means, and then I come up later on to this other item which describes what a charlatan is while it's testing something else, I've just given away the answer to the first question in the second question. Now, sometimes that's difficult to see, but one review you should do of your items is to ensure to the best you can that you're not making this error in giving away the answer to some of the questions by the nature of the way you wrote the stems in other items. You'll see this happen. That make sense? So those are some general rules. Now some things about writing stems. I have a whole set of rules about how to write them. So you want to write the stems so that they're written precisely, but it can get too technical. You know, some of the language, technical language, can be very unique and not generally used. So you need to be careful that while you're precise with your language, you're not using language and using technical terms that wouldn't be commonly known. So you want to be careful to use technical terms that are the more common ones, because you often have a couple options about what to call something, and choose the one that's more common. This is the one I probably spend most of my time working with when I'm reviewing someone's items and doing item editing, is the economy of words. And this is correlated with the reading difficulty issue because more words usually increases the reading difficulty. But there are lots of extra words that people put in questions that simply serve no purpose. My favorite is, which of the following? Why do you need all those words? What's wrong with what? Or which? You don't need of the following. And other short phrases. Now, that may seem trivial and silly, but if you're taking 100 items and each stem has an extra 5 or 6 words that it doesn't need, you've just created a lot of extra testing time that's not productive to anybody, the test taker, that are serving no purpose because they're reading words that aren't helpful. So find ways to make your sentence structure simple. It's not supposed to be interesting prose. It's a question. So you would like to keep it clear, precise, and short. So this is a small thing, perhaps, but again, it speaks to efficiency in reading for the test taker. If you can see in the first poor example there's a phrase that appears repeatedly in the answers. Whenever I see that, I take the phrase out and I put it in the stem. There's no need to have it 4 times. It busies up the page, there's extra clutter in reading. So I always change the STEM to include what's redundant in the alternatives. And it's not always this clear, but you'll see that happen reasonably often. So wouldn't you rather read the second question than the first one? So how often have you taken a test question and you got it wrong because you didn't see the not, or the never, or the except? So one of the rules I try to follow is whenever you're saying which is not true, I underline it, boldface it, capitalize it. Don't want someone to get tripped up because they didn't see a key word that might be easy to miss. Yes?
Many educators try to write very tricky questions, and in fact, they're evaluated for the quality of their assessment. So I'm just addressing the elephant or dinosaur in the room is that, in some cases, it's meant to be tricky, and the smarter students assume to be the one that was able to figure out the trick. So how would you address the fact that has that perspective?
So the question is many test writers at universities intentionally make tricky questions because the best students will get the tricks. So I would like to have a conversation saying, can we use the word a problem-solving question? So are we just not using the same word? Are you actually writing a good problem-solving questions? Or is there something tricky about it? And here's how I would know. I would look at the data, and a tricky question is often gotten wrong by your best students. So that's one way to identify a tricky question. If I find that an item and I put a pool of the best test takers together, and I look at the data for the best test takers, and I find that they get this one item wrong all the time, and they're getting 90, 100%, there's something wrong with that question. And if it was supposed to be a tricky question, it's a bad tricky question. I'd have a dialogue and say, is this really a good problem-solving question, and you're using the word tricky? I have no problem with good problem-solving questions that make subtle distinctions. I don't know if I've answered your question, but that's a good question. Sure. So this is a simple thing to fix, but a good practice. Acronyms. Generally spell out acronyms. Not everybody knows what their acronym means. Does everybody know what WYSIWYG means? Probably not, but they know what you see is what you get, that they can make sense of that, because you're not usually testing what does the acronym mean. That's a pretty trivial item. So you don't want someone to get something wrong because they didn't know what the acronym meant. So spell out, in most cases, spell out the acronym. So sometimes you can write items that there's a clue in the stem that gives away the right answer. And so this can be harder to see, but if you intentionally look for these sorts of things, you might capture it. This particular one here, variances in the cost may cause changes in all of the following. The only one that's not plural up there, because this is a singular kind of question, the only one that's singular up there is the right answer. All the others are plural. It says, which variances in cost? There are subtle things. Test takers who don't know the content are going to look for weaknesses in the items. So sometimes something in the stem gives away what the right answer is. Oftentimes, it's the grammar. The grammar of the stem follows naturally into the right answer, because often you write that first. You write the grammar for the stem, you write the grammar for the right answer, and they all fit very nicely in the style. And then you write wrong answers, and the style of them and the grammar of them is different. And that's a cue to the test taker who doesn't know what the right answer is on what to guess at. So they're going to guess at the one that fits best. So that's what I was trying to get at with this here. And so you want to look at that to make sure you haven't given it away. So those are some suggestions for writing your stems. And so this is a summary of them. And then I have a few more rules for you about writing the distractors and alternatives, and then I'll let you get to your day. As I said earlier, 4 or 5 alternatives is the best choice because it lowers the chance of guessing the right answer. It can be challenging to do that. Number 2 might seem silly. Each question should have 1 correct answer. So I routinely take my items and I give them to other item writers. So this person writes 5 items, I write 5 items, we switch them. And we identify what we think the right answer is. And sometimes people don't agree. I mean, bright, knowledgeable experts don't always agree. So usually try to facilitate a conversation for clarity, and it might mean that this statement, the stem wasn't written clearly. But in the end, my rule is if subject matter experts can't agree, throw it out. When in doubt, throw it out. Because if they can't agree, you can't really not expect test takers to clearly understand what the right answer is. So that will happen. To write good distractors, you might think of typical problems that novices make, typical problems that the minimally competent person makes, whether it be in school or in work. They make for good distractors. Writing the correct answer is usually pretty easy. Writing the stem, if you've done a good task analysis, if you've done a good curriculum review, writing the stem and the right answer is not too difficult. But writing good quality alternatives, distractors, wrong answers, that's the hard part. And I don't know if any of your test takers would disagree with me, but that's where I find people struggle with. So if you think about common errors people make, that's one way to get that wrong answers. There's software now to randomize both the order of the items and the order of the alternatives, which is good practice. That you can order, the software will order A, B, C, and D, and different persons will get different orders of A, B, C, and D for the same item. That's good. And then where the item appears in the test. That's generally best to randomize that too. So writing clear and concise alternatives is evident. That's important to do. I have the statement here, simple is good. Just like with the stem, keep it simple. The double negatives here, I don't know if that's a common practice in your language. It's not real common in English, but you will see double negatives. And that's not good sentence structure for our test, especially. There's my comment before about the complexity of words. There's a set of words, my utilize and use, and there's some others in English. Someone will say ameliorate instead of improve. Again, it raises the reading difficulty, so keep word structure simple. Try as I might and tell test takers not to do it, these complex alternatives where A and B in the above, A, B, and C in the above, B and C of the above, it's a very complicated item. It takes time to write it. It takes time to read it. They're not good items. And quite often when you do item analysis, you find out they didn't do very well. There are actually several items in that one item, so you've lost the opportunity to write more items. Make that more simple. So when you see those kinds of combination alternatives, I always tell them to rewrite them. Okay, well, I'm almost done. Thank you. Sometimes you look at the alternatives, the set of alternatives, and they're not similar in content. They're not. One of them just doesn't fit, and that's because the item writer is having a hard time finding one more wrong thing to say. So they made something up that just doesn't fit, and so sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not so obvious. want to write distractors that are fairly common in their content. They all kind of fit together. They're not from some completely different domain. So as a subject matter expert, you can judge that best, whether or not all the alternatives fit together in a domain. This is a point about making them grammatically consistent. All the alternatives should be grammatically consistent. So when you write your alternatives, read the stem for each alternative and make sure that they all follow similarly in its grammar and its style. Because as I said before, when they don't, it's a suggestion that it's a wrong answer. So I showed you this example before where the first one is two things, and all the others are single things, whereas the alternatives down here are all pairs. I don't know if you've come across items, I do occasionally, where someone's trying to be kind of humorous or not sufficiently professional in how they wrote the items. So that'll occur occasionally. So just keep an eye out for something that is not a proper professional style in its writing. And it's someone I suspect this guy's a bit tired in their item writing. Here's something that's a bit subtle. Oftentimes the right answer requires some explanation. So you end up writing a long, to be precise, correct answer. But all your wrong answers are short, because you can think of wrong answers as easily that are short things. So what happens is the right answer is a nice, clear, long statement, and everything else is really short and kind of obviously not right. That gives away what the right answer is. Again, we'll do an item analysis, and we'll find out that this item doesn't work. The opposite can happen, where the right answer is very short, and you're trying to come up with wrong answers, so you write these long, kind of tortured statements to be wrong answered. So you'll see this real unevenness in the size of the number of words and the complexity of the right answer versus the wrong answers. So you want to review your alternatives to see that you didn't do that. This is small things. If you have numbers, write the answers in numerical order. So these are the top ones are not from small to large. It makes it just easier for the test taker to scan through the numbers and see it. So small thing, but it helps the test taker. Occasionally I find people who have overlapping ranges. If the answer alternatives are ranges, be careful you don't have overlapping ranges. Like if you have 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, you have overlapping ranges. 20s in both alternatives, 30s in two alternatives. So small thing, but again, keep an eye out. None of the above. Generally recommend not using none of the above unless there's calculations involved. If calculations involved, none of the above is not a bad choice, because what happens if you don't use none of the above, a person can take all your alternatives and put them back in the formula and see which one works. And they really didn't know how to calculate it, they just worked backwards. If you have none of the above, that makes that strategy less successful. So generally don't use none of the above, but when you have math calculations, it's a pretty good alternative. Alternatively, don't use all of the above. All of the above makes it easier to guess the right answer, because if just two are probably right, the answer is all of the above. Because if two are correct, then it's got to be all of the above, or it's likely to be all of the above. So all of the above, I discourage people from writing that. It often is the alternative that you write because you can't come up with another alternative, so you opt for that. Always and never, I discourage always and never, because in a lot of, especially problem-solving questions, always and never, somebody can often think of an exception to the rule, especially your brightest test takers. And you just have to be careful about always and never. So I discourage the use of always and never in the items. You also find alternatives that are two versions of the same thing, and that's what the highlighted ones are. They're really the same alternative. It's just the test item writer was having a hard time coming up with another good distractor, so just rewrote the same one with very minor differences. This is tedious to find this sort of thing, but it happens fairly commonly. And then finally, last rule is writing opposites is generally not good practice when you have pairs that are opposites. So when I see people include that, I tell them don't write opposites or alternatives. It suggests that those pairs can't be right, so it weakens the items. So all of this gets discovered in an item analysis, so the item gets thrown out eventually through an item analysis. So if you stick to the rules as best you can, fewer of your items will get thrown out, and all the hard work you did will go for good use. So those are my rules. That's just a little summary. We're not going to have writing. So we've covered, that's the topic we covered. I want to say, I don't speak Arabic, but I did look it up on Google, and I hope that says thank you correctly. So I thank you for your time and attention. I've enjoyed it very much. Thank you. If there are questions, we have time, so please.
What a nice and deep session. Thank you, Dr. Paul. We have about 15 minutes for comments and questions. Please make your comments or questions very brief, less than 30 seconds, please. Let's start from ladies over there. If you have any comments, questions, please.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you. About
Once you ask me, I'll repeat it. What's the question?
we want to ask you about the new orientations of the job and the skills for the next 10 years. Yeah, new orientations. Yeah.
So your question is about testing new orientation? So are you asking about best practices in new orientation and testing skills? So organizations do many different things with regard to new orientation. If I'm understanding your question, I'll give you an example. So several pharmaceutical companies, large pharmaceutical companies, when they bring an employee on, they're provisionally hired, and as part of their orientation, they have to master aspects of their job, which is product knowledge. So they're learning their job, they're getting oriented in the company, and as they master the product knowledge, they're assessed. And their passing the assessment determines whether they continue to be hired. So that's unique, but I thought if you're asking about interesting practices, that was one.
I have a question about the job analysis you talking about. Is this only for the pre-recruiting, or it must be a team hired by the organization to come and measure? What is the job title and what is the job description for this people here, and the outcome should be, and compare it with the actual outcomes that happen inside this organization, and measure the gap between both things. And this is important to happen in, once a while inside each of these organizations.
So the question is about job analysis and the alignment of those who do the job analysis with what actually goes on inside the organization. As I understand you correctly? So this is a very important part of job analysis. If you're in charge of running a job analysis, if that's the outcome, you did not set up the job analysis properly. So the people who do the job analysis have to have access to key people in the company. And I often use who are the thought leaders in the company who know where the company's trying to go with their work process, and the job analysis needs to talk to the experts who know that. And if the design of the job analysis does not include that connection, it's a flawed design. So what you described happens, but it would happen because the planning was inadequate. The job analysts did not have the expertise or the knowledge about how to execute a proper job analysis. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Excuse me. My question regarding in an education setting. I wonder how is it going to be different for assessing future skills, creativity and critical thinking? How is it going to be different than the test that you built and introduce it to us? And if there is another alternative to assess these skills?
So you have a special challenge about future skills, and I know you're addressing that. The job analysis should be done more than just one time. And if you build a relationship with the target job families and organizations that have that target job family, they will work with you to understand what the requirements are in their industry for that job family. And they'll be very happy to work with educational institutions that you understand what their needs are, because they know the new needs first. Where do new skills and knowledge typically come from? It's a new work process, it's a new invention, it's a new idea, and then they would love to get that into the educational institutions quickly by some process. I suggest a job analysis and a relationship, so that now your curriculum, your assessments are focused on the same things they need. So that would be my suggestion, is that you build relationships around job analysis practices that can go on readily, periodically, so that you're getting firsthand knowledge from the thought leaders and organizations as work changes and demand changes for skills and knowledge. Does that make sense? Maybe?
Thank you, Professor, for your great presentation. So one of my friends has course colorism cut. So how can we make a good and fair exam or test for him? Thank you.
Sure. Testing individuals with special needs and disabilities is a special difficulty and problem. A common practice in the case where it's attention issue, hyperactivity issue, is to add about 50% more time to complete an assessment. So that's one approach. Another approach is to ask the individual if they know what would be a helpful accommodation in the testing situation. It's called a reasonable accommodation. So in this case, the person may say, well, it would be helpful if someone would read the material to me, and I can respond to an oral presentation of the material that instead of having to read it, which is more challenging. But probably the best advice is to the person who needs an accommodation, they may know best what they need. So that would be among the first things I'd do, is say, what would help you? Now you have to be, as the test administrator, judge whether that's a fair accommodation or not, but they often know what would make it easier for them. And it's often quite unique to the individual.
Thank you very much for this good and nice presentation, and we have understood too many things actually. Thank you very much. And I want to ask you something outside this subject about the international examinations, TIMSS and BERS and PISA. And here in this lounge, there are many teachers are attending this meeting, and supervisors who are responsible for preparing students for these examinations. And I want you to recommend, what are your recommendations for the teachers to make their students prepared for the TIMSS and BERS and PISA for the elementary school and secondary and intermediate levels? Please.
It's a very challenging question. It's a good question, though. The first thing I might ask, if you were to say, assess the adequacy of the testing and the test preparation, is to look at the documentation behind the blueprints for the tests that are being used, and understanding what they're intending to measure and assessing how well the tests are measuring them, if that's all done well, and I have no reason to presume it's not, then I would take that documentation and build my curriculum around that proper documentation. Because that's what the test, if it's done properly, is measuring from a proper blueprint. Proper blueprint came from some documentation. What is that documentation? What is the blueprint? That blueprint can then not only drive the test content, but curriculum design. And so I would weigh that in my curriculum design and instruction to ensure that all of that, my 3 Venn diagrams from before, that all that stuff overlaps as much as possible. So alignment is important, and understanding if there's proper alignment. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Excuse me, I still have
Please,
one
Dr.
question.
Paul.
Thank you so much for the helpful guidelines. I previously asked you about the cognitive flexibility, how to measure it in students, because there is no specific questions or guidelines to write these questions. I don't know if it's a mental skill that should not be, I cannot find tests for, or is there anything helpful for this? Thank you.
Sure. So the question was about cognitive complexity, flexibility, flexible thinking. I will look up, and I believe I know of a cognitive flexibility test. I can't think of his name offhand, but it's true that there are not many cognitive flexibility measures, and I can't vouch for the quality of the test. So there, as you probably know, many tests that are published, quite a lot of them do not have very good psychometric characteristics. So if you can't find a good measure, then your only choice is to make one. And so the making one means that you have to define the construct in a very clear way. And then I would also ask, what setting will it be given for? And if it's given in technology setting. So flexibility for technology. So that says that you need examples, tasks from that setting that experts say, this is an example where a technology person has to act in a way that is cognitively flexible. And here are examples of when they do it well, and here's examples when they don't do it well, and this is the critical incidents I talked a little bit about, and gathering information about how that skill expresses itself in a real work setting, if that's your goal, to test it in a work setting. The question was, how important is cognitive flexibility in the work setting?
Because we can just test them prior to the job about what we need them to do. But when the person is actually inside the company or whatever, some situations occur, and they are sometimes they don't have any description of how do the employee implements them. So I want to know, is there measurements for this? Is it a skill that must be found in a person, that he should be flexible toward change in any situation he's put in?
It's not commonly measured. The short answer is not commonly measured. I don't think any employer would say that it's not important to be cognitively flexible. But I would say you'll rarely find an employer who's routinely measuring it. Now, having said that, I know from work in assessment centers with managers that cognitive flexibility was measured, and it was measured through an exercise that required them to recognize the need to be flexible and to show flexible thinking. That's in some assessment center for management skills. But I don't know offhand of any IT organization that routinely screens their IT people on cognitive flexibility, although they'd all say it was worthwhile, I'm sure. Good question, hard problem.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Paul. May you please, if I may add, Dr. Paul was one of the international experts that really helped and support us in what we call the proposed national framework for employability skills or future skills. In addition, he actually has helped us in training selective academic and professions in writing item related to future skills. So please say thank you for Dr. Paul. Thank you, Dr. Paul. Dr. Paul is available in consultation corner, or ask the expert. طيب. نيابة عنكم ونيابة عن هيئة تقويم التعليم, on behalf of you and Education Evaluation Committee, I would like to say thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you so much. My pleasure. And this is very simple.